Anything that got missed, I can answer during the Q&A. Sorry about that. Um, and so agricultural revolution was really the beginning of what we see as a human supremacist relationship to other species. And over the course of millennia, with Enlightenment ideology, religion, and even scientific ideology, we only reinforced human supremacy. So it's a worldview that exists in all of our systems today: education, policy, law, etc. And then around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, with the rise of civilizations, we also had a rise of patriarchy and other social hierarchies that emerged from that created a lot of the isms that we see today, based on the ideology of, for example, racism, classism, sexism, etc. Not that some of these inequities didn't exist before, but just like agricultural revolution, the rise of civilization systematically institutionalized these hierarchies and of domination and oppression. Last couple of hundred years, I'm skipping over obviously a lot of history here, but the main point is last couple hundred years ago, we had the discovery of fossil fuels, which led to the exponential rise in technological advancements, scientific advancements, leading to an exponential growth in the human population from 1 billion in about 1800 to 8 billion and counting today. This is the largest and fastest growth that we've seen in human population over the course of our history as Homo sapiens. A lot of ecologists call this an aberration, an abnormality in a species behavior. And it has really come at the expense of the larger living world and their existence and well-being. Today, we are in a state of extreme ecological overshoot where we are demanding 75% more from Earth than Earth can sustainably provide. And that means a lot of the crises that we're experiencing, the climate crisis, the sixth mass extinction, the global toxification, plastic crisis, resource scarcity, are all under the umbrella of ecological overshoot. So population is at the heart of so many issues. It's obviously not the only issue. We have so many other ideologies like growth economics, technological fundamentalism, the progress narrative, this idea that we need to just keep growing our species, both in consumerism through capitalism. But population is an issue that multiplies all of the other problems. And it's an issue that is very difficult to talk about often. And there are reasons behind it, even though it is a scientific fact that we are overpopulated. Even the word overpopulation is considered in many circles an inappropriate word. But I'll get to that in a second. So, for instance, we see population denial among leading nonprofits such as Sierra Club, who will call overpopulation a myth and say that there's dangerous connotations associated with talking about overpopulation. The Union of Concerned Scientists will say, we're sometimes asked, isn't population growth driving climate change? But that's the wrong question, they say, and it can lead to dangerous answers. So we see dangerous appearing twice here. And Fridays for Future, which is an offshoot of Greta Thunberg's work, calls it again, what is the overpopulation myth? It's the belief that there are more people than the planet is able to sustain. So it would lead you to think that there is no limit to the number of people the planet can sustain. These kinds of statements, that means 10 billion, 15, 20, we can keep adding, and it implies that there is no limit to it. And the question is, why are leading scientific bodies or justice-oriented bodies like this so afraid to talk about what is right in front of our eyes? It doesn't take much for an average person to look around and say, there's too many people demanding too much, and we're having an adverse impact on the rest of the planet. Overpopulation is a scientific fact. The United Nations, the leading climate change body, IPCC, the Royal Society, and tens of thousands of signatories under the scientists' warning papers have noted overpopulation along with overconsumption and growth economics to be the key drivers of our ecological and social crises. So why is it so hard to talk about overpopulation? I've identified 4 areas that make it difficult for us to talk about population: human supremacy, a false dichotomy between population and consumption, past coercive policies, and pronatalism, which is the societal pressures on people to have children. Human supremacy, something that a lot of us here will be familiar with, is a worldview that sees humans as superior to all other life forms and gives ourselves permission to do whatever we want to them, their bodies, their lives, and their habitats. And so human supremacy looks like this, where more than half of Earth's habitable land is used to grow food for one species. 80% of that land is being used for animal agriculture, but agriculture is not the only way we are harming other species. We are literally cutting away their habitats through logging to make more space for development. We are trawling, fishing, decimating them for superstitions, medicinal use, body parts, or simply creating roads and infrastructure right in the middle of their homes and communities. Today, compared to 10,000 years ago when the agricultural revolution began, when we started dominating and oppressing animals and plants, we and the animals that we keep for food and kill for food represent 96% of the total mammalian biomass. Only 4% are free living animals today. 10,000 years ago, before we started dominating them, that number was 99%. 99% of mammals were free living beings. We were the 1% of free living beings alongside them in a rightful place, but not the most dominant species. In just the last 200 years, as our population has grown from 1 billion to 8 billion, and our consumption has grown by a factor of 100, species are going extinct at a rate 1,000 times faster than normal background rates. So the reason human supremacy is mentioned as a population taboo reason is because if we think we are the most supreme beings on Earth, then we don't need to talk about population and our consumption because we don't care about what we're doing to any of the other species. What else could be at play, given the fact that we are unwilling to look at the lives and well-being of others? The other issue here is the false population consumption dichotomy, which is that, in the last 200 years, even though our population has grown by 8 our consumption has grown by a whopping 100 times. A lot of people will say, like we saw with Sierra Club or Greenpeace, it's overconsumption that's an issue, not overpopulation. And there's some truth to that, but it's not either or. They are both an issue. Population is a threat multiplier. The more consumers we have, the more consumption we engage in. But the reason there is some truth to the concern about population versus consumption is because the rich world, including the world that we inhabit, so US, Canada, Australia, etc., we are consuming disproportionately more than many of the non-industrialized countries. And for if everybody lived like an average Canadian, we would need 5 Earths to sustain our population. So there's good reason to be pointing to overconsumerism of the rich world as an issue, because that is a great inequality. And the reason we've been able to consume the way we do is because we have extracted from and sent over our wastes to some of these non-industrialized countries who, through these inequitable geo-global political power hierarchies, do not have what we have today. So there's good reason to point to that. But we cannot stop the conversation there. And the reason being, the distribution of population around the world is also quite disproportionate. So the global south represents 3/4 of the total human population, and the rich world, primarily the global north, represents only 1/4 of the world's population. That means the hyperconsumerism of the rich world, which is the 25%, has contributed disproportionately to many of the crises, but that doesn't mean that 75% of the world can be completely ignored because they've contributed less. Everyone is contributing at different levels. And also, people living in the global south are not choosing to live in low material conditions, low material security. They deserve and have every right to expand their level of consumption. And by saying that we shouldn't talk about population is basically saying people who are living poor lives should continue to live poor lives, which is also not fair. The other thing that's often missed in this conversation, if we only keep it to the global north, global south, is the fact that the middle class, the global middle class, is the fastest growing demographic today. And most of that population, the rise in the middle class, is coming from global south countries. For example, 88% of the next billion entrants into the middle class will be from Asia. India and China being the 2 most populous countries in the world, bringing most of that global middle class population. So, that's the dichotomy that often gets missed in this population consumption argument. It is not either or, it is both. We need to absolutely be targeting the hyperconsumerism of the global north through policies like degrowth and well-being economies, but we also need to be questioning the population growth everywhere. The third issue, I think that maybe many of you will be familiar with in terms of why population is a taboo, is that there were many coercive policies in our recent past. Policies that targeted some of the most disenfranchised people by preventing them from having children or the number of children that they wanted, whether it was through forced sterilization, primarily targeting people of color or marginalized poorer people in non-industrialized countries. There were a number of such policies that were put into place when we first started learning about population as an issue. So it was really around the 50s, like right after the Second World War, that population became a core issue within the United Nations. And we recognized it as not just a factor in human rights, in terms of perpetuating cycles of poverty, but also environmental degradation, that the growing population was harming the very environment that we depend on. And a number of policies were put into place. Many of them recognized that the only reason population was growing in places where it was still growing was because of patriarchal norms that prevented people, primarily women, from accessing fertility management and education. It's because of religious norms, economic norms that pushed people to have large families to grow and strengthen the institutions that rely on population. And the countries and communities that did it correctly targeted those patriarchal, harmful norms and allowed women, especially, to gain access to education and to contraceptives and fertility and reproductive health care. But because there were a number of policies that kind of doubled down, instead of understanding patriarchy at the root of population growth, they doubled down and started taking away reproductive rights from people who already didn't have reproductive rights in place. So instead of patriarchal forces pushing people to have kids, now we've got governments telling people they can't have kids. So women especially, but I think many, like even men, became the center of reproductive abuse as a result of really lack of insightful policymaking. And even though these were the majority of the policies, things like forced sterilization campaigns and China's one-child policy, for example, became such globally known that people just immediately conflated all population narratives with the terrible policies, not realizing that the only reason population growth was an issue was because people didn't have autonomy in the first place. And as a result, population really got wiped off the development and conservation agenda. Really, it's because of the most empowering policies that we started to see such incredible decline in fertility rates in the 60s and 70s, because as soon as people have reproductive choice, what do? They exercise it, and they tend to have smaller families. What got missed in this narrative was efforts to increase birth rates for thousands of years were actually far more pervasive and far more prevalent than efforts to lower birth rates in our recent human history. And this is what I'll talk about next, which is pronatalism, the societal and institutional pressures on people to have children and large families. As I mentioned, the agricultural revolution that gave birth to the human supremacist worldview was the fundamental oppression. That's the first oppression where we started to see ourselves as supreme beings. Not all of us, obviously, because there's also hierarchies within human beings, but in being able to tame and dominate nature and other species gave us basically the template, the blueprint for doing that to other people that we could consider to be just like animals. So animalizing other people by seeing them as lower than some allowed women, for example, through patriarchy, to then start being oppressed. And then you start seeing the rise of slavery, classism, etc. Now, how did patriarchy come to be, and why was it essential for civilizations here, the rise of civilizations, to succeed? Civilizations prior to city-states, we were, as I said, for 99 or more of our human history, we're living as gatherer and hunting societies in smaller tribes as nomadic for a good chunk of our history. And civilizational states really were the first time we became settlement societies where we started to create property that we then needed to protect. And that became possible really because of availability of excess food. We didn't have to think about our next meal. We could store food. And in order to grow these city-states and become powerful, what did empires need? They needed population. They needed more people to strengthen the state. They needed disposable people to be able to do the work for them, to build things, but also to protect the state. So we needed a larger military. So believe it or not, prior to the rise of civilizations, human beings lived in more egalitarian ways than we live today. Women had more power than they do today, and more autonomy, even reproductive autonomy, than we do today. Because in order to create more people, women had to be oppressed and sent back. Well, not back, really, it's the first time at an institutional levels where they had to be oppressed to become primarily reproductive vessels for the military state and the city state, so that we could create lots of more people. And men were pushed into military. And that's really also where this binary kind of gender divide of feminism and masculinity really, really took shape. And so the rise of patriarchy then represents also the institutionalization of pronatalism, the institutional pressures put on people to have children. One of the recent authors that we had on our podcast, her name is Angela Saini. She wrote a book called The Patriarchs, How Men Came to Rule, where she anthropologically follows the rise of this pronatalist pressures through religion, education, policy, media, where parenthood was elevated and valorized, and non-parenthood and non-marriage was really insulted and stigmatized. Today, pronatalism shows up in a number of ways. We have cultural pressures from family for grandchildren or to carry on our genealogical legacy, religion for more followers. Almost all religions are pronatalist. From corporations for more consumers, and from politicians, we need always more taxpayers, the militarism for a larger military, or ethnocentric wars where people are fighting to have more of their kind of people, whether it's anti-immigrant narrative or nativist narrative around the world. And pronatalism shows up in a number of ways. I don't know if we have a speaker, but I have.
It should. If you press play, it should be.
I have a really short trailer from a recent film called My So-Called Selfish Life, which is a kind of a lighthearted look at pronatalism in today's policies.
Nobody doesn't want kids.
People cannot want kids. It's a thing.
That is not a thing.
Well, it's my thing.
I've known since high school that I did not want to be a mother.
At one point, you just declared that if I ever want to have grandchildren, don't look at me.
I didn't really ever want kids, but I always assumed I would have them. I kept asking myself, is this gonna happen to me? Does it have to happen?
What does it mean to live in a world where motherhood is our destiny? And what happens if we say no?
Remember, your biological clock is ticking.
Gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby. You have a biological clock not ticking within me. So the answer would have to be no.
There's no biological reason for that to happen. You could list any number of honors and degrees, and somebody will still think that you're not fully accomplished if you haven't had a child.
Motherhood has increased in value yet again. It's almost fetishized in our society.
This is the real solution to climate change. Babies.
Nations need childbirth.
Babies are good for the economy.
This is by design. It's like, I'm not missing anything. You forget to have kids. I'm just not interested.
Have somebody tell you you don't know what's best for you is extremely condescending and insulting. Never question my African identity because I'm child free. You can be an aunt or an uncle to your friends' children and you'll be fine. In fact, you'll be great.
Don't forget to take your pill. I won't.
So that's kind of a lighthearted way of looking at a pervasive force that is pronatalism and the different ways in which it acts in our lives. And of course, for something to be successful, propaganda has to be very, done really well through humor and through kind of accessible messaging. It's not always in your face for it to be successful. So we see that through policies and through media narratives that, again, valorize the baby bump or pregnancy or large families and often stigmatize people who don't fit the dominant narratives. And it's not to say that there is one right or wrong path. It's just to understand the influence of these messages on our decisions. And we may still make that same decision, but the question is, are we making an informed choice, or are we simply doing it because it's everywhere around us? Some of the, less kind of lighthearted aspects of pronatalism today, the way they show up, is almost 650 million women and girls alive today were married as children. So children are raising children. That's an aspect of pronatalism. Globally, more than half of all pregnancies are unintended. And because of lack of access to reproductive health care, many of these pregnancies end up becoming unwanted births, which then go on to create unnecessary suffering for parents and children involved. There are over 200 million women who wish to avoid a pregnancy today, but cannot, not because they don't have access necessarily to reproductive health care or even contraceptives. You could have free birth control pill available, right in the corner store. But it's the psychological barriers, it's the familial barriers, it's the shame that's associated with religion that tells you that if you take birth control, you are committing a sin, or that you are promiscuous, or that by not creating large families, you are defying what God would want. So it's this psychological barriers that prevent so many people from being able to make authentic and liberated decisions. You can see it in the messages, including in, news outlets like in Canada. where politicians feel completely free to talk about women's biological clocks, which is a myth, but politicians telling people to have 3 or more kids, or 4, if you have 4 kids, you will, have no income tax for life. If you have 10 or more children, you'll get a Mother Heroine Award and some money. But others go as far as banning abortion and reproductive health care and access to, even contraceptives, because women are failing to produce the number of babies that are necessary to keep the nation or the economy or the religion going. Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, for example, has said, "We will defend Christian culture and will not surrender the country to aliens. Instead of just numbers, we want Hungarian children. Migration is surrender." So that's an ethnocentric, religious nationalist reason for having more children. Elon Musk, who has become the biggest mouthpiece for population collapse narrative, says that population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. And the urge to have sex and procreate has been subverted by birth control and abortion, leading to population decline. And because he has so much control, politicians are literally taking away those things, birth control and abortion, in order to coercively make people produce babies. So as I wrap up this presentation, where does the animal liberation through procreative justice come into play here? Given the fact that human expansionism has been the largest factor in the decimation and oppression of other species, we must be able to not only talk about human overpopulation, but also discuss the factors driving human overpopulation, which is the lack of procreative autonomy and decision-making for most people around the world. Many people think that challenging pronatalism is the same as advocating antinatalism, or saying that nobody should have children. We reject both philosophies on the grounds that pronatalism pushes people to do something that is against their desires. Antinatalism, whether it's born out of philosophical or ideological agenda, tells people to not have children or blames them for having children. Both of them really undermine reproductive autonomy, which is something that most people around the world do not have today. Instead, what we advocate for is reproductive autonomy, so that most people around the world, at least as a bare minimum, have the liberation to make choices for themselves. And once we have informed choice, we can act responsibly. We can make that choice in an informed manner. And what does that look like? First, autonomy must be the most basic human right that must be afforded to everyone, free from pronatalism. Once we are privileged with choice, we can think about how our reproductive choice, just like all of our consumptive choices, have impacts. What does it mean to bring children into a world today? Do I have the necessary means to support a child? Do I need to be worried about the child's future given the cascading social and ecological crises? What does it mean about my obligation toward other beings, humans and non-humans who are already here? Can I expand my family through kinship with other species? And lastly, how does our decision-making factor in ecological and planetary boundaries? Not seeing Earth as some kind of a human colony that is there to support us and our needs, but Earth as a sacrosanct home that it really is what we need to thrive. So I will basically end off by saying, currently, the UN population projections show that if we do absolutely nothing to our current policies and our narratives, we are projected to add another 2 billion people to the planet this century, so that would be 10 billion people. But with just a 0.5 decrease in the total fertility rate, that means half a child on average less than what we're currently having. We go down to 6 billion. Do you know how easy it is to reduce total fertility rate from 2.3 today to 1.8? It literally means affording choice to people. And immediately we see fertility rates go down. In fact, in the last 50 years, fertility rates went from 5, on average, the number of children women were having, to 2, around 2.5. So it halved in just 50 years. So compare that to just a 0.5 change, and we are 4 billion less. But if people like Musk and other authoritarian governments become even more authoritarian, more pronatalist, we could see our population go up to 15 or 14 billion just through coercive policies. So really, what procreative justice means and what we should be advocating for is to accelerate the fertility decline that we're seeing because of the reproductive rights that it affords people, but also because of the lessened burden on the planet. And with that, I will end off and open it up to questions. Thank you so much for your attention today. There's a lot I didn't cover, but I'm hoping that that can come up in questions.